royal woman. With a gloss, with Bruce Oldfield clothes, with headphones on and bopping, and clearly being totally unsuited for stuffy old Charles.
And for that matter, far more exciting than the Queen herself. Yet every few years through the 70s and 80s, Elizabeth kept on visiting Australia, opening buildings, making speeches, brushing away flies, doing her duty.
In some sense, one of the worst jobs in the world, I would say.
She knew it was going to be salt mines, and she just went quietly to work.
The thing you notice when you meet the Queen is that she's not peering over your shoulder to see if there's someone more important in the room, because there's no one more important in the room than her. And so she's one of these people, very few in public life, who just looks at you, and you are the star when that happens.
Still, gradually, Australia and the monarchy were drawing apart. In 1984, Bob Hawke replaced God Save the Queen with Advance Australia Fair.
The Commonwealth Games and the Olympics, we'd win a medal, and up they get, and they'd play the God Save the Queen. I thought, bugger that, it's not on.
Republican sentiment was steadily gathering strength. And in 1992, when Elizabeth toured Australia for the 12th time, a new Prime Minister had been in the job for just 6 weeks. Paul Keating tapped into a brash new Australian nationalism. He set about throwing off the last vestiges of colonial cringe.
Just as Great Britain some time ago sought to make her future secure in the European community, so Australia now vigorously seeks partnership with countries in our own region. Our outlook is necessarily independent.
Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating has made a strongly worded attack on Britain.
British media branded the speech unwelcome.
Prime Minister's wife Anita today angered royalists by replacing the traditional curtsy with a bow of the head, and Paul Keating himself abandoned customary deference, placing his arm around the royal waist.
One British tabloid dubbed him the Lizard of Oz.
I was standing in that reception in Parliament in Canberra, right behind the Queen and Paul Keating. He barely touched her shoulder. If it hadn't been for the media reaction, I mean, the Queen certainly didn't notice it at all.
The Queen said to me, take no notice of them. She said, take no notice of them. I said, I haven't.
The same old fogies who doffed their lids and tugged the fall up to the British establishment.
While Paul Keating fanned the Republican debate in Australia, Elizabeth had more pressing problems at home. The marriages of 3 of her children were failing, painfully and in public. When the future King and Queen both admitted to adultery on television, Queen Elizabeth advised Charles and Diana to seek an early divorce.
The marital track record of the Queen's children has been so bad that it has done permanent damage to the image of the British throne all over the world, but perhaps particularly in those countries where the future of the crown is under question.
You become a little bit disappointed and disheartened, especially with Charles and Diana. That was rather sad to see the way it went. This is a replica of Diana's wedding ring. Well, the dolls, of course, they were marvellous. That was like the Elvis Presley outfit in the white. That's always been one of my favourites. It looks reasonably like her.
I, Paul John Keating, do swear that I will well and truly serve Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
In 1993, after what he called the sweetest election victory of all, Paul Keating swore to serve Her Majesty. But 6 months later, he flew to Balmoral, Scotland, to deliver the Queen a different message. In his view, he told her, the monarchy had passed its Australian use-by date.
I said to her how Australia had changed as Britain had changed. Britain had become part of Europe. Australia had become part of the region it lived in. Of course, the cultural ties and the historical ties and the affection would never change. but that the time had come when Australia's head of state was an Australian and not a British person. And while it might have been somewhat upsetting, the inevitability of that conversation was pretty obvious to her. She said at the end, "I think I need a stiff drink." I said, "Make that too."
Paul Keating set a timetable for change, but his time ran out. By 1996, he was the one out of a job. His successor was as staunch a monarchist as Keating had been a Republican.
We have not been elected to be just a pale imitation of the government that we have replaced.
John Howard acknowledged that Republican feeling was running strong. He committed his new government to a referendum to let the people decide on Australia's constitutional future.
It was somewhat ironical that a constitutional monarchist should put up the first ever referendum to turn Australia into a republic. I acknowledge that, but I wasn't going to create a situation where people could say, well, look, everybody in Australia wants a republic and the only bloke holding it back is Howard because he's a monarchist.
But long before the referendum could take place, Australia was reminded that the true power of royalty is not contained by constitutions. In Britain, Diana's sudden, tragic death in 1997 drove a wedge between a public that adored her and a royal family that had rejected the princess. In Australia, the reaction was simpler. Shock left little room for controversy.
Diana's death was so shocking, so unexpected, that I think at first people just couldn't believe it.
Her tragic death was a reminder that the link with that family is still very strong as far as the Australian public is concerned.
When Diana died, Aboriginal groups held funeral ceremonies for her and were very upset about what had happened to her. It was a mark of respect for the royal family and for the Queen who had lost a daughter-in-law and the princess who had lost a mother.
All of us have a desperate need to love. It's a profoundly irrational emotion, but that is the essential appeal of the monarchy. So long as they live up to certain standards which we essentially impose, they qualify for our love. The emotion when people die is just as important as the emotions of birth and youth and marriage.
After 100 years of being wedded to the monarchy, in 1999, Australians faced a momentous decision. As the referendum campaign gathered momentum, most observers in Australia and Britain expected a vote for change.
The Queen's position had been clear all along. She valued her position as head of state and enjoyed the association with Australia and with the Australian people. If it continued as a monarchy, the Queen would be delighted. If there was a change at some point, then that change would be respected and absorbed immediately.
The people want an elected president.
Don't tell me that Australians will not have the right to pick their own president.
A resident for president was the Republican war cry.
Our Republic proposal.
But those advocating a yes vote were bitterly divided over the model. Should federal parliament be left to appoint an Australian head of state? Or should all Australians choose one for themselves?
That is the danger of having an elected president.
Are we having a real republic or are we having a false god republic?
Because he or she would get delusions of grandeur.
Why do they have to take away our Queen?
Monarchists campaigned for the status quo and urged Republicans to vote no to the proposal for a president appointed by Parliament.
I voted against it. I did reluctantly vote for the Republic.
What a silly question.
I voted against it.
I was probably fishing it that day.
I voted against it too.
I held my breath and hoped.
I never tell people how I vote on anything.
I voted no.
The count took little more than an hour.
The Australian people have had their say and they have said no.
Britain as a whole was delighted that the Australians had apparently voted for monarchy. We thought it was a great victory for the Queen and maybe even the British link still, the sentimental link. But certainly that wasn't the view in Buckingham Palace. I mean, Prince Philip said, "What's the matter with these bloody people? Don't they know what's good for them?" And the Queen, with a sort of, this remark I think sort of sums up her clarity of thinking. She said they couldn't agree on the model, which showed she totally understood.
A majority in all 6 states voted no. Yet the result was close. 45% of Australians voted for constitutional change, a homegrown head of state.
I think she realises that most Australians want us to be a republic.
Do you think everyone likes the Queen in Australia?
Yeah, sure. That's why we won the vote.
Indeed, whether they voted for monarchy or president, most Australians do like the Queen. And soon after the referendum, in a speech in Sydney, she made plain that whatever the future relationship, the liking is mutual.
It is not for nothing that the anthem is Advance Australia Fair. Whatever the future may bring, my lasting respect and deep affection for Australia and Australians everywhere will remain as strong as ever. That is what I have come here to say.
I think in her own mind, she thought it would be a reasonable thing for Australia to vote yes, because after all, the majority of members of the Commonwealth are republics. And I think she was right in thinking that to some extent it was a tribute to herself personally.
Perhaps many Australians did vote for Elizabeth, rather than the British Crown. If so, then she's likely to be the last king or queen to reign over us.
Elizabeth still represents the best of the past to people in Britain and in Australia. And clearly the monarchy is safe in both countries, so long as she is alive. I mean, why jettison this woman and all she's done and all she stands for and all the memories, particularly for older generations, and what she makes people feel in our hearts. But Prince Charles is a totally different cup of tea.
Charles I'm not as fond of.
No, King Charles III.
I really don't think he would do much for the community.
That's a joke.
Yeah, I'd rather see one of the younger fellas.
The Queen does a far better job.
If we become a Republican, he will not be our Queen.
I think we're going to see an Australian Republic succeeding Queen Elizabeth, and that will be her great legacy to Australia.
We have to wait until Queen Elizabeth II, God love her, passes from this world. I mean, how weak is that?
Given the longevity of her mother, the Queen could be well in her hundreds before she leaves the throne, and I think that's too long to wait.
The grandchildren say to me, well, I can't see the point, Nanny, because they live over in England and we live over here, and really, they don't have anything to do with our lives, so I can't see why we have to be attached to them so much. But I realise you love the Queen because you grew up and that was what it was like then.
In our youth lies the destiny of the world of the future. With Elizabeth, they well may live on into the 21st century, which we but glimpse along the misty corridors of time. May it be a better, cleaner world. God bless Elizabeth. Long may she reign.